Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It's so nice to have you all here. I'm right on the air ventilation. This is going to be good. I'm going to maintain dry for the rest of the time. Thank you for having me and not having Stephen Douglas or any other personage that's more famous than I am. I don't often get to do these sort of more academic pursuits. Just last week, I was in Springfield, Massachusetts, presenting my impression of Samuel Colt, the revolver king, inventor of the handgun, essentially our modern weapon. And in that program, I shared a vignette about Samuel Colt. Samuel Colt was a lover of history, and I'm going somewhere with this. He loved history, he loved Hartford, he loved Connecticut, he loved America, loved the founding, loved the Revolutionary War, and he was presented with a cane by members of a local group, a military organization he was a part of. These guys who would march around, they would sing songs and sort of do patriotic things and acts of charity. And he was given a cane that had all these different kinds of wood in it. It included a piece of old Ironsides, a piece of the timber from Mount Vernon, and it had a piece of the great venerable charter oak, which if you go to Connecticut, it's on the back of our state quarter. Very important piece of arboreal sort of history. And what's interesting to me is reading about the Van Wagenen property, reading about the apple tree house. I understand, legend has it, that when Lafayette returned to the house years after his meeting with George Washington, he was presented with a cane containing wood from that apple tree under which he stood with the general. So that to me was a very interesting moment of just the way people observed history in those days, the way they presented talismans and objects to each other, and the way that people appreciated place. This wonderful house is a great victory of place for this city. Now, first of all, I want to thank Bill, I want to thank Erin, and others from the new Journal Square Community Association, the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, and of course the city of Jersey City. Full disclosure, I am not a Jersey City resident. Please don't judge me. But I live in Brooklyn now, in New York City, but I have become smitten with JC. I have visited several times in my years living in New York, and I've really come to love this place, just for the promise that it holds, its closeness to this great megatropolis across the water. That can be very taxing and tiring. You can kind of flip a switch and leave it whenever you like and join it whenever you like. I think it has a lot of potential, and I think this city has had a lot of victories over abandonment, over lack of vacancy, and that is something that's very exciting. And so I'm hoping to bring all of this together in this talk this evening. We will contend with urban exploration. What is it? URBEX, as it is called. We're going to talk about some of the historical background surrounding properties that are abandoned, why they are abandoned, why they are so curious to us, how they can be saved, if they should be saved, some of the ethical concerns that surround urban exploration, and we're going to hopefully tie it all to Jersey City. First of all, I'd like to open with some participation with the audience. Are there any urban explorers in the room? Show of hands.
What do you mean by
Anyone who self-identifies as urban explorer? Yes? You're all being very charitable. Thank you. Okay. Let's unpack this a little bit more. So if you're a little unsure if you can identify as an urban explorer, have you ever walked by a property that you've seen boarded up and wondered, I wonder what it looks like inside? That looks like a great old building. Yeah. All right, there we go. So we're getting in. Now, how many of us have then walked by that property or a fence where it says, do not enter, and you entered? Knowing there are no law enforcement officers here, no one's going to get in trouble. It's okay, it's a safe space. Just turn to the camera. No. So whether or not you have a curiosity, whether or not you've acted on it, whether or not you've done something illegal, I would argue that many of us possess the qualities of urban explorers. And that's what we're here to identify. You don't have to be a historian, you don't have to be a learned individual, you don't have to be a professional. Urban exploration, URBEX, is a global phenomenon. It's very hot right now, and it's very hot in cities in America, but it is something that is happening all over the world. And so, what is urban exploration? What is URBEX? We're going to lay down some scenarios for you in which I hope to define urban exploration better. First, let's imagine a group of teenagers break into an abandoned factory. Sound familiar? Yeah. They are taking photos and they're hoping to find a paranormal entity. Instead, they find themselves embroiled in a mystery involving masked ne'er-do-wells and the Harlem Globetrotters, all those thieving kids. This one I don't think actually happened. Another situation. Let's assume there's a family going on a hike in a local park and a young child trips over the vestiges of an old rail bed. The whole family is then taken by the discovery of this archaeological asset, and they begin to discover, they begin to uncover what is lying beneath their feet. Another scenario. A young man from a smaller city opposite a larger city enters a newly constructed tower, sneaks past a guard, and scales the building, dangling from a precipice, taking selfies. This actually happened. The man pictured here, of course, Justin Casquejo, I believe a resident of Jersey City, who famously, a daredevil as he was known, scaled the heights of One World Trade shortly after it was topped out, and he has then since been sentenced, I believe, to some sort of community service. We might think of all of these people and all of these scenarios as different, as mutually exclusive, but I believe they all share a common link. It's an engagement with place, an engagement with the illicit, with sometimes the unrestricted. This is a very hot topic with young people. It's a very interesting topic for those seeking to make sense of their world, maybe for those who haven't lived through a history in which they saw a factory that employed people and then closed down. They just see the closed down factory and wonder why, how, what's inside. I can't go in, I need to see something. This is where urban exploration comes from. I thought that it would be prudent to look to the Urban Dictionary to help define urban exploration. This is getting very deep, ladies and gentlemen. There are several definitions on the Urban Dictionary's website. Of course, this word is a mashup, a portmanteau, combining two words, shortened from URBEX in this apparent definition, meaning urban exploration. The URBEX adventure is enthralling, addictive, and oft misunderstood. I like that last part most of all. How do you use URBEX in a sentence, according to Urban Dictionary? URBEX gives me that rush that I refuse to live without. That's just one definition. There are several. It gets a little deeper. URBEX, short for urban exploration. It is the act of exploring places in a city you normally don't get to see or aren't allowed in, such as abandoned buildings, drains, or rooftops. Something else that we're just going to skirt on this issue are these sites of sort of old rail beds and drains, or sort of utilitarian sites that become sort of fetishized in the urban exploration imagination. There's really cool videos on YouTube, people doing URBEX. My favorite channel is Fogarty Avenue, so this is obviously put on by a urban explorer. And the more you look at YouTube and the World Wide Web, you will discover a whole marketplace of urban exploration media that is intensely fascinating. And this is sort of safe armchair URBEX you can do from your home, your smartphone, wherever you are. I am going to offer another definition that's a little wider. Urban exploration, or URBEX, an activity or interest in sites of ruin, abandonment, legend, or restriction. Often, this activity is associated with illicit behaviors, including trespassing or vandalism, while also encompassing a curiosity with the unknown, with historical imagination, and with play. I was speaking to a gentleman a few minutes ago who was discussing his own personal history of play in urban exploration in Jersey City years ago. This is where we're going to reach a little bit of a crossroads. I think urban exploration on the whole has a bad rap. People tend to think of it as something that bored kids are doing and they're just causing trouble, finding a place to drink, to do drugs, whatever. And that may be true, but I do believe there is more to it. And all of us who have these urban exploration impulses, I think, are drawn to it from different places. So I'm going to draw a distinction now at this part of the talk. There's illicit urban exploration and there's sanctioned urban exploration. Now, what do I mean by that definition? Well, illicit is something that would be illegal, something in which by doing that you're trespassing, you could get in trouble, you could receive a fine. Many urban exploration how-tos sort of command that you keep money on you to get out of jail and all kinds of other things. That's not the kind of urban exploration I'm interested in. I'm interested in safe, sanctioned urban exploration that can be done with safety. Sites that are reclaimed, that were once guarded or once closed off to the public, but still have those elements of curiosity embedded, are the sites to which I am interested. Many national park sites, state park sites that take over old railways or old factory sites, industrial sites, fall into this category. By being at the park, you are not doing anything wrong, but you're also examining an artifact of some bygone industry or foodway or something that sort of tugs on that curiosity. And I think we all possess that curiosity because we all exist in this urban plane, and we all want to make sense of the hodgepodge of things around us. Why do we explore? I can think of several reasons. One, to make memories, to post something on the internet saying, "I was here," and put your flag down. To document decrepitude, which is all around us, and it's very compelling. How did this come into this condition? To make a discovery, to find something, to uncover a history, to find an artifact, a souvenir, something to take with you. I was also speaking to Aaron about the strange sounds this house can be known to make. People are sometimes searching for the paranormal, searching for an encounter with something beyond this realm. We explore to understand our communities. The abandoned house at the end of the road, what story does it possess? What does it tell us about our neighborhood? What does it tell us about our community, our town, our city, our state? We also want to place ourselves in a historical timeline, understanding the time in which we live. And urban exploration right now, I think, is a very unique moment. And to misbehave. People like to do things that are illicit, that are exciting, that are dangerous. And I think urban exploration does also appeal in that regard. Again, doing it on YouTube, completely safe and not harmful to anyone. Also, to go off the grid, to leave this ordered world. Our world today is increasingly monitored by cameras. We're always connected. Our phones are everywhere. To leave everything that is monitored, to be alone, especially in an urban environment, is very appealing. There are studies done with neuroscience that if you're walking on a surface that is flat and rigid and same always, your brain is understimulated. But the moment that your foot, hopefully with a shoe, touches broken glass and you hear that crunch or leaves under your foot, your brain is sent with stimulation. And there's something to be said about looking for a new environment that will stimulate us mentally, emotionally, in a sense of historic, in a sense of place. I'd like to identify some common threads with regard to urban exploration. Where are these places? What kind of places are we talking about? I'm not going to be able to list every single place that is explored in an urban environment, but I want to identify some common threads. One is industrial. This is the Hydro Puff Factory, as seen from the New Jersey Turnpike by exit 15E. Our country became rapidly industrialized in the 19th century, in the 20th centuries, but by the 1970s, the sort of post-industrial wave would begin to crash, leaving behind all of this infrastructure, all of these factories. I hail from the state of Connecticut originally, and every town made something. My town made silver, but when I was growing up, there was no silver production. The silver factory had long been closed up. And so I grew up in a sort of post-industrial reality, but someone in my parents' generation would remember working in that factory, or their parents working in that factory, making an honest day's wage in that factory, and then bemoaning the loss of that work. And so for them, it was an eyesore. It was something they did not want to see, a memory they did not want to relive. But for me, I was intensely interested in uncovering it, in understanding it, in trying to bring it back to life. There's industrial, there's institutional. And by that, I refer to college campuses, or in this sense, sites of mental health, so mental health facilities. This is a big one in the URBEX movement. If you do a quick search on YouTube, usually comes up abandoned building mental hospital. And it's very popular because it's very mythic. People like to experience sites where suffering occurred. There's something known as death tourism. Believe me, the place I work currently, there is a a market for that. Throughout our national landscape, we are littered with these sites that have been left behind, and their current state reveals something about our relationship with that history. There's also, and that's of course a picture from the Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital, which has been demolished. This photo is residential. This is a very interesting, gaudy mansion that has since burned down. It is in Colts Neck. It was destroyed by fire. It was owned by a gentleman who was arrested for bank fraud. It was a very popular URBEX site before it was destroyed by fire, which may or may not have been related to urban exploration activities. So residential, I think, is a big thread in the Jersey City environment based on the work that I've done, looking at the residential sites in the city that have been left behind. Military. The 20th century saw huge advancements in the military-industrial complex all over our country. In the 19th century, the series of defenses being built, forts that were being built in our harbors, guarding our shores, were then scaled back in favor of Nike missile sites and others. This is a photo from Fort Hancock, Middletown Township. And there are some others that we can play with as well. One of my favorites is ghost towns. This particular ghost town in this photograph is very unique. This is from a photo called German Village. It was a series of buildings built in the German vernacular architectural construction in the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. These buildings were constructed to reveal the damage inflicted upon them by nuclear tests. And so the German village was built, destroyed by a test, rebuilt several times. And today, the last German village that was built in the mid to late 40s, that was never tested upon, is still there. A ghost town that was never actually inhabited, a sort of ghost town that was rebuilt, sort of like Groundhog Day, over and over again. But we see ghost towns as well in our suburban areas. And I should say, I don't know of SURBEX. I'm calling it all URBEX, whether or not it's near a city center or adjacent. The activity itself, we were going to lump together as urban exploration. Also, there's a sense of toxic sites. Again, I work at a place formerly known as Ground Zero, which was a toxic site, at least for some time. This is, of course, a picture from Pripyat in the Ukraine, a city that was irradiated by the nuclear disaster in Chernobyl in 1986. And this has become one of those international destinations for those really interested in urban exploration. It's a frozen sort of Soviet moment. And I think a lot can be read into our Cold War understanding of urban exploration. The militarization of the 20th century was a result of the Cold War. And we're not going to say we're demilitarized, but spatially, our nation is not as militarily occupying in our landscape. And so leaving behind these hulks, these massive battery casements, these massive sites where once there was military life, now they become sites of abandonment, where nature can reclaim the site, where artists can create new interesting works, where we can explore. But this is a short list. There are many other elements. I think of transportation relics. Are there any other sites of interest that not in this group that anyone would like to?
Churches.
Yes. Thank you, Bill. Yes.
Amusement parks.
Amusement parks, one of my favorites. Anything else?
Power plants.
Power plant. Very good.
Transportation is a big thing around here, what with the Bergen Arches and the railroad.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, transportation is major. And we're going to get to, at the end, imagining what will the sites of the future look like, the sites that we will want to explore. My way into this was through an understanding of mental health facilities. When I was in undergrad college, I went to Eastern Connecticut State, which is very far from here, sort of, by Yukon, essentially. And across the river from the Mohegan Sun Casino was a massive mental hospital that had been shut down. It's called the Norwich State Hospital. And I just encountered it one day driving by and had no context and was just completely taken by the Victorian construction and all these beautiful buildings that were then being beautifully taken back by nature. And I began to research it, and I spoke to friends of mine who lived in the area, and of course they would regale me with stories of breaking in, getting caught, and all these terrible things. Finding various documents still in the site, on the floor, wheelchairs and things like that. And that led me to create an oral history project in my graduate graduate studies in which I interviewed former workers of the mental hospital. And they were greatly conflicted about the site, because on the one hand, the closing of the site meant advancements in their field, but it also meant a lack of work for them in many cases, and also the other negative after effects that came with deinstitutionalization. So everything that we look at, everything around us, exists within a cycle of industrialization and abandonment, institutionalization and deinstitutionalization, development and depopulation, conflict and reconciliation. Even this structure exists within that cycle. This structure is in a victorious upswing. It has been reclaimed by the city. It has been invested in once again. It is being used as a third place in which citizens can come together to exchange ideas. This is an amazing thing. This is the goal, ultimately, for many of these sites and these places. In our current moment, we are in an age of vast ruin and dereliction, as major local and global trends have shifted what you might call our human geography, how we occupy our cities, how we occupy our planet. And I want to give one example that may not necessarily relate to this city, but does relate to the country as a whole. In the mid-19th century, the American Psychiatric Association was formed, 1848. One of their founding members was Thomas Story Kirkbride. Kirkbride believed that housing the mentally ill should conform to various guidelines. His stipulations included that the hospital should be at a distance from city centers, 3 miles. And I've measured this with my odometer. If you go to an abandoned site or the site of where a mental hospital once was, you click on your odometer, it's usually 3 miles exactly from the center of town. There were other stipulations. The grounds should be kept verdant and green and landscaped to perfection. The idea is that the landscape could help heal you. Later, occupational therapy would use patients at the site tending those grounds as a means of healing, as a means of occupying their time. Kirkbride also maintained that the buildings at America's mental hospitals should appear a certain way, which brings us to this slide. Kirkbride Plan, as it was called for large, imposing structures with massive wings expanding outwards, and these would be added to over time. The construction allowed for light and air to circulate freely inwards, which Kirkbride also believed was essential to healing. And in the 20th century, a spree of hospital building occurred in the United States. Many of the facilities maintained a Kirkbride building at its center. And why is this relevant? Well, the first example of this construction was the Trenton State Hospital. The life of the mental hospital in the United States reflects our attitudes in mental health care. At first, the asylums and state hospitals were refuges for what we may call the undesirables of the community. These included those suffering from then undiagnosed mental illness and even alcoholism. For many, the trip to the sanitarium or the asylum was a yearly venture. You'd go in, you'd get clean, you'd go out into the world again, and you'd be brought back once again when circumstance brought you there. The 20th century, so just as quickly as these buildings went up, mental health care progressed immensely. The 20th century saw many new treatments and theories about mental health. Of course, from the more macabre, the ice pick lobotomy, to psychoanalysis, to neuroscience and occupational therapy. With greater specialization in mental health, the rise of pharmaceutical drugs came a conservative movement to change the ways in which society handled the mentally ill. By the 1960s, sites like the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, underfunded, understaffed, and overrun, became known as snake pits, as described by Robert Kennedy. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, many of America's great campuses of mental health were closed in favor of community-based treatments. So that came with its own challenges. Internalizing that community inward put the burden back on the community, but also lessened the overall expense of the large, vast, hard-to-maintain mental hospital. Though these edifying temples of mental health are gone, there still remains stigma, suspicion, and judgment around mental illness. Our society, by abandoning these structures, signals that there is a desire to forget this history and to continue to bury the plight of people who suffer from mental health. The histories behind the sites we explore reveal not only how the place has landed in its current state, but also our own societal narratives and narratives of ourselves. The Trenton Psychiatric Facility is still open, but it is one of just several that are still there. Many are long and forgotten, and many have not been revitalized. If you've been to the College of Staten Island campus, that has reclaimed a lot of the Willowbrook campus. It's very interesting. It's really exciting, I think, what they've done there, and it's an example of what's possible. And they have a community day every year in which they celebrate the history of the site. So they live with it. They don't live without it. So enough about that. Let's talk a little bit about where we are right now. In 2018, we are in a state of ruin overload, ladies and gentlemen. We are inundated with images like this. Coffee table books created from mansions in France, in which photography of urban exploration is rampant. What some people in the scholarly field refer to as abandonment porn, sort of seeing this imagery everywhere. It's ubiquitous, and it's sort of so saturated in our society that it lessens the power of it. I think the first time you see an image like this with crepuscular rays coming through the window, you think, my God, how romantic, how beautiful. And then you see the same image kind of over and over again, sort of duplicated ad infinitum. For example, in one internet search, you can see the same picture over and over and over again. Each one sort of seemingly original, but part of a genre. This media is absolutely everywhere. There are books all about urban exploration. You can do this too. You can locate these hidden sites and you can explore them, which of course can overall lead to their detriment. If these places are being loved to death, there's going to be nothing left for the community organization to come in, or the guardian angel, to revitalize the site. So there is a conflict in that urban exploration motive. This, believe it or not, is a calendar of abandoned places that you can purchase. I think it's just really interesting. Going back, I don't want to say 30, 40 years, I feel like an abandoned place, it still is, it's not something we welcome seeing in our neighborhood. We might welcome seeing it on our calendar, on our fridge, but we don't want to see it in our backyard. We want places to be inhabited. We want places to be clean. We want places to be safe, especially in the urban environment where we're sort of conditioned to be fearful all the time. We want to see things that look safe, that look like they're being used. A building in disrepair is immensely sad to us as human beings, but it's not to nature, which takes it back, which is a whole other part of the story. It occurs to me right now, we are living in an age in which we are saturated with dystopian media. How many television shows on your queue right now involve a future in which something horrible has happened? The zombie apocalypse, we're living in Gilead all of a sudden, it's terrible, it's Handmaid's Tale, what have you. This is an image from The Walking Dead, very popular television show about a zombie apocalypse. These abandoned sites are the perfect backdrops for these media representations. So a lot of filming is done in these places. There's one other example I'd like to show you. This is Fort McComb, which is outside of New Orleans in Louisiana. We're going way out of New Jersey right now. It was built in the 1820s as part of the third system of seacoast defense, which was built and became redundant in our country almost immediately. The fort was decommissioned after the Civil War. It was occupied by Confederate forces, so it has that little juicy piece of our history. The ruins were then further ravaged by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Now, this particular site, which had not seen action in decades, which is very hard to get to. You can't walk there. You have to take a boat. It's extremely illegal. It's not safe. This site, because of its exclusivity, became a very popular site in several media representations. I don't want to give any spoilers away here, but if you've seen True Detective, the last episode takes place at Fort McComb. Carcosa, yes. In the same year, months later, I was shocked and confirmed by the internet that when Beyonce's Lemonade came out, she also filmed at Fort McComb.
Oh my God.
Two vastly different media representations for vastly different audiences taking place in the same spot. That same sense of imagination, that sense of wonder, that sense of where is that? The same place. So this is the moment in which we're living, and I think that is sort of, okay, Beyonce, that's sort of proof positive of this ruin overload, this zeitgeist that we have. But as a historian, I do want to offer some historic backdrop, which may give more information to support this. This is also a favorite image of mine. I believe this is from the History Channel show that was on for a while, Life After People. We're very interested in looking at the world without us. We're very interested in removing ourselves from the equation. We know, if you work for a city, if you have a home, you know how hard it is to protect your home from the ravages of nature. You know how much work it entails to maintain that veil of society that we have, that safety that we have in our domestic realms. And in just a few short years, nature reclaims that which has been abandoned. And many of the abandoned sites today become havens for nature. And that's going to bring us to an example that I'll discuss in Jersey City. I will bring us back home, I promise. But first, I want to take us back to the beginning of our sort of national story. When this country began, it was it was unspoiled territory. The Hudson River artists were immensely captivated by the land, and a new school of landscape painting would be brought about. I'm focusing on the works of Thomas Cole, one of my favorites in the Hudson River School. The young republic is expanding outward very quickly. There is very little regulation. Think about our railroad titans who are carving deep cuts into our cities, into our countries, into our national parks as they would become. And artists like Thomas Cole saw themselves as uniquely qualified to make a comment about that unrestricted development. This first image is Dream of Arcadia from 1838, which takes place in Greece, of course. Seeing the temple in the background. Remember that America was immensely fascinated with Greek, Egyptian, and Roman symbolism. Now, of course, those societies had all sort of crumbled and had a post-empire history to them, but America fetishized those ruins and would rebuild their new houses of power, of Congress. Think of the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee. We have copied all of that here in America and using all that imagery to co-opt the thrust of those democratic societies in our democratic republic. This is one such painting which depicts a beautiful harmony between man and nature. There is development, there is religion, there is society, there is all of those elements, those trappings, but yet nature is allowed to flourish. Thomas Cole also made a sort of darker series of images called The Course of Empire. This one is Desolation, 1836, focusing on a column, on a dead port. This is where a great city once was. And if we do not watch out, if we do not regulate our development, if we don't check our own empire, our own manifest destiny, we are bound for the same fate. Our columned temples will soon look like this. And so this goes to show that these images are romantic, they're beautiful, they're popular, and they are something that is deeply seated in the American consciousness. We are fascinated by ruins that are thousands of years old. We're fascinated by the Wailing Wall. We're fascinated by Athens. We're fascinated by these sites. And our sites are much younger. But now we are contending with our own ruins and what some may call a deferred greatness, something that we had maintained and now have lost. And I think no matter what your political persuasion, that sometimes feels like it's the case. There's another idea that I sometimes think about with regards to urban exploration in our modern context, and that's with one of our first historians, Frederick Jackson Turner, gentleman seen here, not often thought about today. Turner was responsible for an idea called the Frontier Thesis, which he presented in a paper in Chicago in 1893. He submitted that the American identity was wrapped up in expansion, in movement, in exploration, in settlement towards the West. And he saw the West as the place where the unique American identity would be born, at the juncture between civilization of settlement and savagery of wilderness. Again, speaking to that sense of balance. The existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement explain American development. Now, this thesis would become very popular and very deeply embedded in the American psyche. But when we get to California, when we settle everything in between, we get Alaska and Hawaii, where do we go next? 1960s, you got it. President Kennedy's going to take us to the moon. That's the new frontier. Well, that allure of that frontier has faded, I would argue, in our national imagination. And so as that wave of frontier expansion has splashed against the western coast, it is now coming back to these sites of abandonment. This is another frontier that we can explore. This quote from Turner also, I think, explains a lot of what urban exploration might be. Each age tries to form its own conception of the past. Each age writes the history of the past anew with reference to the conditions uppermost in its own time. Basically, it's all about context. It's all about the time in which this history is being written, the comment that is being made on the current time. Now, I want to focus for a few minutes about my adventures, urban exploration in Jersey City. My absolute favorite by far is Reservoir Number 3. What an amazing place. Commissioned in the 1870s to bring water to Ellis Island and to this city, the third reservoir outgrew itself very quickly and was decommissioned very early in its life as advancements in utilities would take over. Other reservoirs in Jersey City would be demolished, but Reservoir Number 3 would remain. And it was preserved in decrepitude, in abandonment for decades, but has become a new modern oasis for the people of this city. Journeying here as I did, I was really taken by the beauty of this place. The calorie pear trees were all in bloom, and so it was kind of stinky, but it was lovely. I met some wonderful people from the Preservation Alliance who were showing people how to fish, how to rig their lures, and they even showed me the path to the wall. I saw a man walking on the wall towards one of the far pump house structures, and I thought, I really want to do that, but I want to set a good example, and I'm giving this talk, and I don't want to get in trouble. Bill wouldn't like that. So I asked the gentleman, I said, is there a way to get up there? And they said, of course, he has a path. And I just went up to the path, and I walked on top of the wall, ensconced in nature. I saw beautiful birds that day that have populated the site. I yielded to a family of Canadian geese. I put myself in harm's way climbing down around one of the lower unsafe structures, which I discovered had been inhabited by humans at one point. This is a beautiful thing. This provides, as the interpretive labels surrounding the reservoir note, a oasis, an escape from the urban environment, a place in which we can live free of the city. And because of its abandonment, it was allowed to survive. It was not redeveloped. It was not done away with. It was not buried. It is a wonderful gem, a true treasure, and I'm just very happy to have found it. This is what I would describe as sanctioned URBEX. I did not cross a single red line. I didn't go through any portals that I wasn't allowed to. I was simply afforded a nice walk in the woods around the water that felt completely right, but still felt novel. It still felt new. It still felt interesting. I was still curious about the structures, about the things in the area. That itch was scratched by Reservoir Number 3. So I think to that preservation group, I'm extremely thankful. But there are many others. I work at the 9/11 Memorial Museum. Many of our collections are housed in one of the former LORILLARD buildings, now known as Manna Contemporary. So of course, this is one of the last outposts. LORILLARD was, and the reason I'm saying it's 9/11 related, because our collection, a lot of our collection is housed in that building. So it's a really fantastic place. Manna offers a third place to the people of the city, a site where culture, art, can exist in fervor. The LORILLARD Company, interestingly, was one of the last cigarette companies above the Mason-Dixon line to exist. And 100 years after this was built, it was taken over by Mana Contemporary and has become a real cultural venue for the city. Fantastic place as well. Another one of my favorites, which is also adjacently related to the World Trade Center, the Hudson in Manhattan Powerhouse. This structure, again, saved sort of by the grace of God. The fact that the Port Authority did not demolish this thing, I think is amazing. For years, this was the abandoned powerhouse. Think of coal, the early ways in which trains were shuttled back and forth for the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, the HMRR. So the famous McAdoo tunnels, or Mickadoo tunnels, I'm Irish, I don't know how to pronounce it, go underneath the Hudson River, shrinking down the half-hour ferry ride across the river to mere minutes. Of course, I rode on the path tubes today. The abandoned infrastructure, or I should say the decaying infrastructure of the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad does not exist in New York City. They were beautiful, not beautiful, but handsome twin-tower terminal buildings at the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad terminus. And they were demolished when the Port Authority took the land by eminent domain to create the World Trade Center. By that time, the powerhouse was already abandoned. It had been for decades, and it continued to go into more ruin. This is an older photo. But this building is slated for revitalization. It is slated for a new life. There's also supposed to be a residential tower next to it and commercial uses in the building. But I was hard-pressed to find many extant examples of abandonment in Jersey City. There certainly are abandoned residential structures. There still are other industrial sites that are coming back. But overall, it seems as though this entire area is, exploding in growth. And of course, that is related to a very bad word in many of our analyses, gentrification. And this group, as far as I can understand, is dedicated to smart growth and not to just the rampant retaking of a city. And so that, I think, is so immensely important. Of course, the Van Wagenen homestead, seen here in darker days, has been brought back to life. That's the place that we're in right now. And so Journal Square has come a long way. Jersey City has come a long way. And that is a testament to the people of the city, to the city itself, which is reinvesting in itself. Where once industry and transportation would sort of do the investment for you in a sense, now the city, local organizations, the public take on those burdens as well. As seen from the back of Mana Contemporary, the Canco Lofts, luxury housing. That's, again, affordable housing is not often part of this conversation, but of course it needs to be if we're going to have a sustainable, diverse city. This is immensely, immensely important. As we move towards the future, there's another site that I wanted to speak of briefly. Has anyone ever been to Bell Labs in Holmdel? Excellent, wonderful. A beautiful example of modern architecture by Eero Saarinen. Bell Labs was employed many people in the area for many years, and when Bell moved out, there was great consternation in the local community. This great, big, vast industrial structure was sort of up for grabs. A developer would buy the property for $27 million, and this is what it looks like before, and it's very beautiful, and this is what it looks like now. It's become something that they're calling a metro burb, Bell Works, a site that maintains its industrial thrust. There are plans to build a hotel on the roof of the structure, towards the roof. Many local startups, tech companies exist in that structure today, and I think that is an example of what we might call an urban park, which is open to the public. Architectural interested people can come to the site and scratch that itch of wanting to see a great icon. This is the same architect of the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, so it's an icon, it's a landmark, it's a beautiful structure, but it's also being used, it's also sustainable, it's also growing the local economy. Just think about the way we work today versus the way we worked 30 years ago. The gig economy, where we are today. People aren't employed by these massive concerns anymore like they once were. So this is, I think, where things are going. And this is a talk about the past, and it's a talk about the present, but it's also a talk about where we are going. Where will we explore next? This is an image from New York City, boo, the High Line, okay? So the High Line, I think, is a perfect example of decaying infrastructure that probably few people thought of as anything interesting. Very few people I can imagine actually explored this object, this piece of urbanism, because it would be so hard to get to. And it really wouldn't offer anything interesting. But with a little bit of imagination, a little bit of investment, community support, it becomes a internationally renowned public park and causes us to readjust our relationship with the environment, our thinking about parks. I'm sure many of you have seen this image of one of the proposed revisions to the Bergen Arches. This idea that a new park in the style of the High Line could exist. And this is a very beautiful imaginary image, but I think it is an example of what could be. And without the High Line, we wouldn't really have this thinking, I don't think. We have wonderful linear trails in our country, as we do in Europe. We're taking back the roads that were laid by rail. But this is something that I think would be wonderful for Jersey City in the time to come. But I am short several $1 million, so I cannot make that happen. But I'm curious. I had an exercise when I was in an astronomy class in which a professor asked for us to think of sites that would be left behind by our society, and to imagine what the astronomers or archaeologists of the future might think of them. And I was assigned a baseball diamond. And I thought it was really interesting to think of, okay, if I'm using my historical imagination, I'm thinking about the future, what are people going to think about this field with these clearly marked angles and these lines? And I sort of interpreted it through the idea of like Stonehenge, that if you turned the azimuth of the sun a certain way on a certain day, perhaps certain shadows would be cast. Everybody's watching in the audience, they all go ooh and ah, and you know, they come back next year for the other holiday, I don't know. But right now we're living in an age dominated by the automobile. What if the automobile goes away in 50 years, 100 years? That young lady in the back, her children's children will wonder, what was a gas station? What was a parking lot? Think about things that are ubiquitous in our society, that we take for granted, that we live along with. They can become mysterious. They can become objects of wonder to the next generation. And I want to know, maybe from the audience, any other imaginary thoughts about other sites of abandonment. What might be abandoned in the future that would give us pause?
Retail stores.
Yes! Okay, fantastic example, retail.
Shopping malls.
There is a whole website about dead malls. So we're already going towards that. But yes, the 1980s, we see a huge surge in mall building in the suburbs. But now with Amazon and all the e-commerce, all of that has gone away. Again, Americans changed the way they purchase things, and so the malls are already becoming sites of abandonment. But yes, I think retail sites would be one. If the religiosity of this country goes through a major shift, again, sites of worship might become places where urban exploration thrives. And we already see these things in churches that are decommissioned, that are dechristened, what have you. Any other ideas?
Post office.
Post offices, yes, already becoming an artifact. This is great. You guys are doing great back there. And usually very edifying buildings built in that Greco-Roman style. The wall surrounding Reservoir Number 3 was an Egyptian revival wall. The idea of bringing water as a sacred aspect to any society. These are all really good suggestions. I want to close with an idea from one of my sort of urban heroes, someone you may know as good thinkers, Jane Jacobs. Of course, Jane Jacobs is responsible for a seminal work of seminal writing in the 20th century, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. One can argue that she won the 20th century over Robert Moses and other big city planners. Jane Jacobs advocated for not for large takings of land, not for what she called towers in the park. She advocated for the ballet of the street. People meeting on the street, people keeping each other safe, life on the street. And that has become the overarching goal of developers. Whenever you see a rendering for a new building, it always has street life, it always has little people on it. That is because of Jane Jacobs, because people know they want street life. They want their city to be vibrant. Some thoughts from Jane. And this one I think is particularly resonant towards urban exploration. By its nature, the metropolis provides what otherwise could be given only by traveling, namely the strange. What is novel, what is interesting, that is what is appealing to us. And finally, this longer quote goes at length about cities and old buildings. Scrolling towards the end. Old ideas can sometimes use new buildings, but new ideas must use old buildings. The idea that an old building, just because it is old, just because it is not modern, does not mean it can be not made sustainable. Does not mean it can't be made usable. Does not mean it can't have another life. Does not mean that it can exist again in this timeline of use of human geography. So I would entreat you all to be confidently identifying as urban explorers in your environment. I hope that this talk has opened up your eyes a little bit about what is often derided as the pastime of teenage punks. And that you see your environment anew, and that you're interested in exploring it. Thank you so much.